On the morning of October 8, 1918, the Argonne Forest was already awake with gunfire. A low mist hung between the trees, clinging to the broken ground and the shell-torn undergrowth. The forest floor was soaked from weeks of rain, churned into mud by artillery and boots, and littered with the remnants of earlier assaults that had failed. For the men of the US 82nd Division, this was not unfamiliar terrain. They had been fighting here for days, pushing forward yard by yard against one of the strongest defensive systems the German army still possessed. The Argonne was not just another battlefield, it was a natural fortress. Dense woods limited visibility to a few dozen yards. Ravines cut through the ground at sharp angles, channeling advancing troops into narrow corridors. German engineers had spent years preparing this ground, building overlapping machine gun positions designed to sweep every approach with interlocking fire. Any unit that moved too fast, too openly, or without perfect coordination was shredded almost immediately. That morning, an American battalion was ordered to advance through one of these ravines. Their objective was simple on paper and deadly in reality: break through the German line, silence the machine guns, and keep the Meuse-Argonne Offensive moving forward. The war was nearing its end, but no one in the forest knew that yet. What they knew was that every delay meant more lives lost. As the Americans advanced, the German guns opened up. The sound was immediate and overwhelming. Heavy machine guns rattled from concealed positions on higher ground, their fire cutting through branches and snapping trunks like matchsticks. Men dropped where they stood. Entire squads were pinned flat against the mud, unable to move forward or back without drawing fire. Officers shouted orders that could barely be heard over the constant hammering of gunfire. Within minutes, the attack stalled. Attempts to maneuver around the gun nests failed. Any movement was spotted and punished. The German positions were too well placed, too well coordinated. The battalion was effectively frozen in place, suffering casualties with no clear way to break the deadlock. It was at this moment, when the attack was already failing, that a small group of American soldiers was ordered to do something desperate. 17 men were pulled aside and told to move around the German flank through a narrow wooded ravine. The plan was risky and vague. They were to slip behind the enemy line, disrupt the machine guns from the rear if possible, and create an opening for the rest of the battalion. It was not a mission with high expectations. It was an attempt born of necessity. Among those 17 men was Alvin C. York. York did not stand out. He was not loud. He was not aggressive. He was a corporal at the time, recently promoted to sergeant, and known more for his discipline than for any reputation as a killer. He carried a rifle, a sidearm, and the same gear as everyone else. Nothing about him suggested that history was about to turn in his direction. The group moved cautiously into the ravine, using the terrain to stay concealed. For a brief moment, it worked. They slipped past the main German firing arcs and emerged behind several machine gun positions. German crews, focused on firing downhill at the stalled American advance, had no idea the enemy was now behind them. The Americans attacked. Several machine gun crews were taken completely by surprise. Some were killed outright. Others were captured before they could react. For a few minutes, it seemed the mission might actually succeed. Then the Germans responded. From higher ground, additional machine guns swung around and opened fire into the ravine. The Americans were suddenly exposed, caught in a bowl of fire with little cover. Bullets tore through the trees and ripped into the men below. One by one, York's companions fell. Within moments, most of the 17 men were dead or wounded. The attack had collapsed again, this time on a smaller, more isolated scale. Those still alive hugged the ground, pinned by fire from multiple directions. Any attempt to move brought a fresh burst of bullets. Retreat was just as dangerous as staying put. At this point, the rational outcome was clear. The survivors would either be killed or captured. The mission was over. But this is where the story diverges from everything that should have happened next. As German soldiers began moving down the slope toward the ravine, preparing to finish off or capture the remaining Americans, one man stood up. Alvin York rose from the mud and brought his rifle to his shoulder. He did not charge. He did not shout. He did not spray bullets wildly. He began firing deliberately, calmly, one shot at a time. Each time a German soldier exposed himself, York fired. Each time another man fell. German troops, believing they were facing a much larger force, attempted to rush him. York switched to his pistol and continued firing at close range, picking off attackers as they came downhill. Witnesses later described the scene as methodical, almost surreal. There was no panic in his movements, no wasted motion. Within minutes, the German advance broke. The surviving German soldiers stopped firing. An officer stepped forward, pistol raised, shouting orders in English. He demanded York surrender. York refused. He kept his weapon trained, unflinching. What followed was one of the most extraordinary surrenders in military history. The German officer, realizing the position was untenable and believing he was facing overwhelming American strength, ordered his men to cease fire and lay down their arms. One by one, German soldiers emerged from the trees, hands raised. Machine gun crews abandoned their weapons. Rifles were stacked on the ground. When the firing stopped, York was standing alone in the ravine, surrounded not by enemies, but by prisoners. By the time it was over, 132 German soldiers had surrendered to him. Not to a platoon, not to a company, to one man. York gathered the prisoners and marched them back through active fire toward American lines. Along the way, stunned US officers stared at the column in disbelief, assuming some kind of mistake had been made. No one could immediately understand how this had happened or who was responsible, but the reality was simple and terrifyingly rare. On that morning in the Argonne Forest, a single soldier broke a defensive system that had stopped an entire battalion. He did not do it with numbers or technology or luck alone. He did it through discipline, marksmanship, and a refusal to yield when every reasonable outcome pointed toward death. The war would end a month later. But on October 8, 1918, the war was very much alive, and in the choking mist of the Argonne, history bent around one man who was never supposed to become a hero at all. Long before the Argonne Forest, long before gunfire and surrender, Alvin York's world was small, quiet, and shaped by the hills of rural Tennessee. He was born in December 1887 in a log cabin in Pall Mall, a remote farming community where survival depended on hard work, faith, and self-reliance. His childhood was defined by labour from an early age. Fields needed tending, animals needed feeding, money was scarce, and every able hand mattered. York learned to shoot not for sport, but for necessity. Hunting put food on the table. Ammunition was expensive, so missed shots were unacceptable. From a young age, he developed a reputation for accuracy, not through formal training, but through repetition and discipline. When he raised a rifle, it was because the shot needed to count. Yet this same man would grow into someone deeply uncomfortable with violence. As York entered adulthood, his life began to shift away from the rougher habits common in his area. Drinking, fighting, and gambling were part of the culture around him, and for a time he took part. Then, in his late 20s, a profound religious transformation changed everything. York became deeply devout, embracing a strict interpretation of Christianity that emphasized humility, obedience to God, and above all, non-violence. He joined a small conservative church that believed killing another human being was incompatible with Christian duty. To York, this was not a symbolic belief, it was literal. Scripture was not open to interpretation. Thou shalt not kill meant exactly that. So when the United States entered the First World War in April 1917, York was horrified. The war in Europe was distant, confusing, and morally troubling to him. He believed wars were the result of human failure, not divine will. When his draft notice arrived, it created a crisis that cut to the core of his identity. Serving in the army would require him to do the very thing his faith forbade. York applied for conscientious objector status. He was sincere, he was consistent, he was also denied. The US Army did not see his religious beliefs as sufficient grounds for exemption. York appealed again. He was denied again. The war demanded men, and the army could not afford to release every soldier who struggled with the moral weight of combat. In November 1917, York was inducted into the army and sent to Camp Gordon, Georgia. There he joined the 82nd Division, a formation composed largely of draftees from across the country. For York, the experience was disorienting. Military life was loud, rigid, and relentlessly secular. Orders replaced scripture. Discipline replaced personal conscience. York clashed almost immediately with his superiors. He refused to train aggressively. He questioned the morality of combat drills. He struggled with the idea that killing could ever be justified, even in war. Officers initially saw him as a problem soldier, someone whose beliefs might undermine unit cohesion. Instead of punishing him, they tried to reason with him. York's company commander and battalion officers spent long evenings talking with him, not as an enemy of the system, but as a man genuinely torn apart by the demands placed upon him. They discussed scripture. They discussed history. They discussed the idea that stopping evil might require force and that defending others could be a moral act. One officer in particular encouraged York to take leave and return home, hoping distance might help him decide. York walked the hills of Tennessee for days, reading his Bible, praying, and wrestling with the question that would not let him go. Was it possible that God allowed war under certain circumstances? Was defending innocent lives different from murder? Could obedience to lawful authority coexist with personal faith? There was no dramatic revelation, no thunderbolt of certainty. There was only a reluctant conclusion. York returned to camp believing that while killing was wrong, failing to protect others from violence could be wrong as well. He did not become enthusiastic about the war. He did not seek combat. But he accepted that, if forced into battle, he would do his duty to the best of his ability. This acceptance did not make him aggressive, it made him controlled. York trained seriously from that point forward. He listened, he learned. His natural shooting ability quickly became obvious to instructors. He was not flashy, he did not boast, but when rifles were raised on the range, York's targets told their own story: tight groupings, consistent accuracy, calm under pressure. When the 82nd Division shipped to France in the spring of 1918, York was no longer questioning whether he would serve. He was questioning how to serve without betraying himself. Combat answered that question brutally and without philosophy. The Western Front was nothing like anything York had imagined. Trenches stank of rot and waste. Artillery thundered day and night. Death was impersonal and constant. Men were not killed in moments of moral clarity. They were killed suddenly, often without warning, sometimes without ever seeing their enemy. York did not seek opportunities to prove himself, but he also did not freeze. When ordered to move, he moved. When ordered to fire, he fired. He did not waste ammunition. He did not panic. Fellow soldiers noticed that he remained steady when others faltered. By the fall of 1918, York was a sergeant. The Meuse-Argonne Offensive was the largest operation the American Expeditionary Forces had ever undertaken. Over 1 million US soldiers were committed to a push intended to break the German army once and for all. The terrain was unforgiving. The resistance was fierce. Casualties were staggering. York's unit had already seen heavy fighting before October 8th, losses mounted, exhaustion was constant, yet there was no relief in sight. Orders kept coming and objectives kept moving forward. When York joined the small flanking group that morning, he did not do so with any sense of destiny. He was not seeking redemption or glory. He went because he was ordered to go, because that was now his understanding of duty. He carried with him the same moral restraint he had always lived by. He did not believe in killing for its own sake. He believed in stopping a threat when no other option remained. That belief would shape every action he took in the ravine. What happened next was not the story of a man who loved war. It was the story of a man who hated it enough to end it as efficiently as possible. And that distinction matters. Because when Alvin York stood up in the Argonne Forest, he did not abandon his faith. He acted according to the harsh logic of survival, guided by discipline rather than rage. The calm precision that defined his upbringing, his beliefs and his training converged in a moment where hesitation would have meant death. The reluctant soldier became decisive, and the war bent accordingly. If you're finding this story valuable, take a moment to subscribe to WW1 HEROES. Every week we tell the full documented stories of men whose actions shaped history, without myths, without exaggeration and without shortcuts. The Argonne Forest was never meant to be a battlefield. It was dense, uneven and claustrophobic, a natural barrier of tangled trees and steep ravines stretching along the border between France and Belgium. Before the war, it had been valued for timber and hunting, not for manoeuvre. Once the fighting reached it, however, the forest became something far more dangerous. It transformed into one of the most lethal defensive zones on the Western Front. By 1918, the German army had turned the Argonne into a layered fortress. The terrain did most of the work for them. Thick undergrowth limited visibility to a few dozen yards at best. Slopes and ridgelines created natural firing positions. Narrow ravines forced attackers into predictable paths. Any force moving through the forest was slowed, compressed and exposed. German doctrine exploited this perfectly. Machine guns were not placed randomly. They were positioned in depth, often on reverse slopes or slightly elevated ground, where they could fire down into ravines without exposing themselves directly. Each gun covered another. If one position was overrun, the next would open fire from a different angle. Artillery registered the likely approach routes in advance, turning clearings and trails into pre-measured killing zones. This system had already stopped French and Allied attacks earlier in the war. By the fall of 1918, it was one of the last intact defensive belts Germany still controlled. When the Meuse-Argonne Offensive began in late September, the American Expeditionary Forces were thrown into this environment at scale. The objective was massive: push north, break the German line and cut critical rail and supply routes. The political pressure was intense. The war had to end decisively and quickly. For the soldiers on the ground, that urgency translated into relentless orders to advance. Units entered the forest with limited maps, poor intelligence and little experience fighting in such terrain. Communication was unreliable. Officers struggled to coordinate movements once units disappeared into the trees. Artillery support was difficult to adjust accurately under the canopy. When attacks stalled, as they often did, there was rarely a clear understanding of why. By October 8th, the area where Alvin York's unit was operating had already absorbed days of brutal fighting. German positions remained largely intact. Machine guns dominated the approaches. American casualties mounted with each attempt to push forward. The battalion that morning was ordered to advance through a narrow sector dominated by multiple machine gun nests. From the German perspective, it was ideal ground. From the American perspective, it was a trap. As the advance began, German fire erupted almost immediately. Guns that had remained silent until the Americans committed now opened up together. Bullets swept the ravines and slopes, cutting off movement and isolating squads. Men dropped flat, pressing into mud and roots for cover that barely existed. The battalion's momentum collapsed within minutes. Officers tried to restore order, but the environment worked against them. Shouting commands was useless. Runners were cut down attempting to move between positions. Any group that stood up to reposition drew fire. The attack became fragmented, reduced to individuals and small clusters clinging to whatever cover they could find. German defenders were disciplined and patient. They did not rush. They allowed the Americans to exhaust themselves against the fire. From concealed positions, they observed, adjusted, and waited for mistakes. It was in this context that the decision decision was made to send a small flanking party forward. The idea was not bold, it was pragmatic. A narrow ravine on one side of the German position appeared less heavily defended. If a small group could move through it undetected, they might reach the rear of the machine gun line and disrupt the fire long enough for the battalion to move again. The group chosen consisted of 17 men. They were not elite troops, they were simply available and capable. Their orders were minimal: move quietly, avoid detection, and engage targets of opportunity. The ravine they entered was steep-sided and thick with brush. Visibility was poor. Sound carried unpredictably. Every snap branch risked exposure. The men moved slowly, spacing themselves carefully, communicating with hand signals and whispers. At first the plan worked. They passed beneath the main arcs of German fire and emerged behind several machine gun positions. German crews were focused downhill, firing continuously at the stalled American attack. They had little reason to expect an enemy behind them. The Americans opened fire at close range. Several German gunners were killed before they could react. Others were captured in confusion. For a brief moment the balance shifted. The constant hammering of machine guns from that sector faltered. Below, some American units sensed a change in the fire and began to move again. But the German defence was not a single line. It was layered. As soon as the rear positions were attacked, higher-level machine guns pivoted. From ridgelines above the ravine, new guns opened fire directly into the flanking party. The Americans were suddenly trapped in a confined space with fire coming from above, across and behind. The effect was devastating. Men fell almost immediately. The ravine offered little protection from plunging fire. Bullets ricocheted through branches and trunks. The group was pinned, unable to advance or withdraw. Wounded men cried out, then fell silent. Within moments, the flanking party was shattered. Those still alive pressed themselves into the earth, trying to make themselves smaller than the bullets. The original mission was no longer relevant. Survival was now the only concern. From the German perspective, the situation looked under control again. A minor threat had been identified and contained. Infantry began moving down the slope toward the ravine, preparing to finish off the survivors or take them prisoner. This was the decisive moment, not because of orders, not because of strategy, but because of the position the terrain forced upon one man. The Argonne Forest compressed everything. It removed distance, limited options, and stripped combat down to its rawest form. There was no room for manoeuvre, no place to hide, no time to hesitate. For Alvin York, the forest eliminated abstraction. There was no war in the abstract. There was no grand offensive. There were only men moving toward him with weapons and the certainty that if they reached him, he and the others would be dead. The environment made the choice brutally simple. Stand up and fight or die where he lay. The Argonne Forest, designed to break armies, had now isolated a single soldier, and in doing so it set the conditions for one of the most improbable moments in military history. In the next moments, York would not be acting as a symbol or a reluctant hero or a man of faith wrestling with morality. He would be acting as a rifleman, and the forest would witness exactly what that meant. When the German infantry began moving down the slope toward the ravine, Alvin York understood the situation with immediate clarity. He was no longer part of a manoeuvre. He was no longer executing a plan. The flanking action had collapsed, and the men around him were either dead, wounded, or pinned so tightly that movement meant certain death. The Germans had identified the ravine as a contained pocket. Their next step was routine: close in, finish the survivors, and restore the machine gun line. York did not wait for that to happen. He rose from the mud slowly, deliberately, exposing himself just enough to see uphill through the trees. The first German soldiers were already in motion, advancing downhill in short rushes, using trees and folds in the ground for cover. They believed they were dealing with a few isolated Americans, already beaten. They were wrong. York raised his rifle and fired. He did not fire rapidly. He did not empty the magazine. He fired one aimed shot, then another. Each time a German soldier exposed himself to move, York took the shot. The men closest to him fell first, collapsing in the brush and blocking the advance of those behind them. Confusion rippled through the German line almost immediately. York shifted position slightly, keeping his profile small. He reloaded calmly, his movements controlled and practiced. This was not a firing range, but the habits he had built over years of hunting took over. He did not track targets wildly. He waited for clear shots. He placed rounds where they would stop the threat immediately. The Germans attempted to respond by rushing him. Several soldiers broke from cover and charged downhill, hoping to overwhelm him with speed. York let them close. When they reached close range, he switched to his pistol and began firing again, methodically, dropping attackers one by one as they came toward him. Later accounts described the scene as unreal. A single American standing upright while German soldiers fell in front of him, the attack dissolving into hesitation and fear. The rush failed. German troops pulled back, taking cover and reassessing. They could not see how many Americans were in the ravine. York's steady, disciplined fire created the illusion of a much larger force. Every attempt to probe forward was met with another precise shot. The slope that had moments earlier been a route of advance became a dead zone. Above them, German machine gun crews hesitated. They had been firing downhill at the main American force. Now they faced an unexpected threat from below and behind. Adjusting their weapons risked exposing themselves. Remaining focused downhill risked being picked off. The initiative had shifted completely. As minutes passed, York continued firing whenever a target presented itself. He did not pursue. He did not chase. He simply denied the Germans the ability to move. His fire controlled the ground. Eventually, a German officer stepped forward from cover. He carried a pistol and shouted in English, demanding that York surrender. The officer believed he was addressing a small group, perhaps a squad leader holding out after a failed attack. York refused. He did not shout back. He did not posture. He simply kept his rifle trained and waited. When German soldiers continued to move despite the officer's commands, York fired again. Another man fell. The officer realized he had lost control of the situation. What the German officer saw was not a lone soldier. He saw an unseen force with excellent marksmanship, positioned in terrain that made direct assault suicidal. He saw machine gun crews already compromised and infantry unwilling to advance. He saw a defensive pocket that could not be reduced without unacceptable losses. He made a decision that saved lives. The officer ordered his men to cease fire. One by one, German soldiers began to emerge from cover. Rifles were lowered, hands went up. Machine gun crews abandoned their weapons. Ammunition belts were dropped into the mud. The forest, which moments earlier had been alive with gunfire, fell into an uneasy silence. York stood his ground, weapons still raised. As more Germans appeared, the scale of the surrender became apparent. This was not a handful of men. This was an entire defensive element collapsing at once. York began directing them forward, ordering them to move downhill and assemble in the ravine. His voice was calm, firm, and unmistakably authoritative. By the time the surrender was complete, 132 German soldiers stood disarmed under York's control. The most dangerous part of the action had not yet begun. York now faced the problem of moving a massive group of prisoners back to American lines through active fire. German machine guns elsewhere in the forest were still engaged. American artillery continued to fall. Any movement risked drawing fire from both sides. York organised the prisoners quickly. He placed them in column and positioned himself where he could observe both the Germans and the terrain ahead. When stray fire cracked overhead, he ordered the prisoners to keep moving. When confusion threatened to break the column, he stepped in personally, restoring order with presence alone. As the column emerged from the trees, American soldiers stared in disbelief. Officers assumed the Germans were advancing. Weapons were raised. Shouts rang out. York had to physically intervene, shouting to prevent his own side from opening fire on the prisoners. When the situation was finally understood, the reaction was stunned silence. No one could immediately grasp what had happened. Reports filtered upwards slowly, then faster. Officers questioned York repeatedly, assuming exaggeration or misunderstanding. Witnesses confirmed the details. Prisoner counts were checked and rechecked. The captured machine guns were examined. The story remained the same. A single soldier had shattered a defensive system that had stopped an entire battalion. York himself offered no dramatization. He did not embellish. He did not frame his actions as heroic. When asked how he had done it, his explanations were simple and technical. He fired when he had to. He aimed carefully. He kept moving just enough to avoid being fixed in one spot. In modern terms, York had achieved local fire superiority alone, but the deeper truth was simpler. The Germans had built a system designed to break mass attacks. It relied on predictability, on numbers, on units behaving according to doctrine. York did not behave like a unit. He behaved like a hunter. He exploited hesitation. He punished exposure. He denied movement. The forest amplified his effectiveness. Limited visibility prevented the Germans from identifying his true strength. The slope compressed their approach. Their own caution worked against them. What followed was not a miracle. It was the outcome of terrain, training, discipline, and timing aligning perfectly for a single moment. By the time the ravine fell silent, the battle had already shifted. The machine gun line was broken. The American advance could resume. A critical section of the German defence had collapsed from the inside. York did not know any of this at the time. He only knew that the firing had stopped, the men in front of him had surrendered, and that the war for him was momentarily over. In the space of a few minutes, he had gone from pinned survivor to controlling force. Not because he sought it, but because the situation demanded someone act decisively when no one else could. This was not glory, it was resolution, and it would echo far beyond the Argonne Forest. The surrender was only the beginning. Alvin York now faced a problem that no training manual prepared him for. He stood in a narrow ravine, deep inside contested territory with 132 enemy prisoners, while gunfire still echoed through the Argonne Forest. German positions remained active nearby. American artillery continued to fall without precise knowledge of who occupied which ground. The situation was fragile, dangerous, and one mistake away from catastrophe. York understood this immediately. A mass of disarmed men was not safety, it was liability. If the prisoners panicked, scattered, or attempted to overpower him, everything he had just achieved would collapse in seconds. If German units higher up the line mistook the movement for an advance, they would open fire. If American troops misread the scene, the prisoners could be cut down by friendly fire. Control mattered more now than firepower. York moved fast. He ordered the German officer to instruct his men to form up and move downhill. The officer complied. German discipline, even in defeat, held. The prisoners obeyed orders, stacking weapons and falling into a loose column. York positioned himself where he could see both the prisoners and the terrain ahead, maintaining constant awareness of movement on all sides. The march began. They moved through brush and shell holes, past fallen trees and the bodies of men killed only minutes earlier. The forest was still alive with danger. Stray bullets snapped overhead. Machine guns rattled in the distance. Artillery thumped somewhere beyond the ridgelines. At several points, German fire cracked close enough to send prisoners flinching and ducking instinctively. York stopped them immediately each time. He spoke firmly, ordering them to keep moving, to stay together, to follow directions exactly. There was no shouting, no theatrics. Authority came from certainty. The prisoners sensed it and complied. As the column neared American lines, the danger intensified. From a distance, American soldiers saw movement emerging from the forest. They could not tell who it was. German counterattacks were expected everywhere. Weapons came up. Fingers tightened on triggers. York broke from the column and ran forward, waving and shouting. He identified himself, explained the situation, and physically placed himself between American rifles and the prisoners behind him. Officers rushed forward, confused, skeptical, and alarmed. Then they began counting. At first, no one believed the number. 100 prisoners seemed implausible. 132 seemed absurd. Officers assumed multiple units must have been involved. York was questioned repeatedly. Other survivors of the flanking party were brought forward to confirm the story. German prisoners were interrogated separately. The accounts matched. The realization spread slowly, then all at once. The firing had stopped not because of artillery or reinforcement, but because a single soldier had dismantled the machine gun line from the inside. The American advance in that sector resumed almost immediately, now facing weakened resistance where none had existed before. The tactical impact was undeniable. Machine gun positions that had stalled a battalion were gone. German defenders were either dead, captured, or forced to withdraw. The advance pressed forward, exploiting the gap York's action had created. What had begun as a desperate flanking attempt had turned into a decisive local breakthrough. York himself barely registered the shift. He was exhausted, shaken, and still operating on adrenaline. When officers congratulated him, he responded simply. When pressed for details, he gave them plainly. He did not frame events as heroism. He described targets, movements, and distances. His tone was factual, almost detached. That detachment would become a defining feature of how the story was told. Reports moved up the chain of command rapidly. Battalion officers forwarded accounts to regimental headquarters. Division staff took notice. Prisoner counts, weapon captures, and witness statements all reinforced the same conclusion. What had happened in the ravine was extraordinary, and it was documented thoroughly. Within days, York was recommended for the highest awards available. The German prisoners themselves contributed to the verification. Officers among them confirmed that they believed they were facing a much larger force. They described the shock of losing men to unseen, precise fire and the decision to surrender rather than suffer annihilation. Their accounts aligned with American testimony in every critical detail. In an army accustomed to exaggeration and rumour, this consistency mattered. When York was finally pulled from the line, he expected little more than a return to routine duty. Instead, he was summoned repeatedly, questioned by senior officers, and informed that his actions were being reviewed at the highest levels. He was uncomfortable with the attention. Public recognition sat uneasily with him. He had not acted for distinction. He had acted because the situation demanded it. When told he would be awarded the Medal of Honor, his response was subdued. He accepted the decision as he accepted orders, respectfully, without celebration. The press, however, reacted differently. Once the story reached the public, it spread rapidly. Headlines emphasized the numbers: 1 man, 1 action, 132 prisoners. In a war defined by mass death and anonymous sacrifice, the clarity of the story cut through everything else. It gave the public something rare, a narrative where individual action mattered visibly and decisively. York became a symbol almost overnight. Yet the reality remained grounded in mud and blood. He returned home not as a warrior eager to relive his moment, but as a man burdened by it. He spoke often about the weight of taking life, even when justified. He rejected attempts to portray the event as effortless or glorious. For him it had been grim, necessary, and final. The march out of the forest marked the end of his direct combat role. The war itself would end just weeks later, on November 11th, 1918. The Argonne Forest, once a maze of death, fell silent. Units moved on, trenches emptied, weapons were laid down. But what happened in that ravine did not fade. It remained in after-action reports, in training discussions, and in the collective memory of soldiers who understood how rare such moments truly were, not because of bravery alone, but because of alignment, terrain, timing, skill, and restraint converged in a way that could not be repeated at will. Alvin York did not change the course of the entire war, but in one narrow slice of it, he ended the fight completely, and that, in a conflict defined by endless attrition, made all the difference. When the gunfire finally receded and the Argonne Forest returned to its uneasy quiet, the war did not pause to reflect on what had happened there. Orders continued, units advanced, men died elsewhere in numbers that dwarfed any single action. Yet within the American command structure, word of what Alvin York had done refused to fade. It demanded explanation, verification, and record. The US Army approached the incident with caution. Extraordinary claims required extraordinary confirmation. Officers interviewed survivors of the flanking party independently. Prisoners were questioned separately, including German officers who had ordered the surrender. Captured weapons were counted and catalogued. Maps were reviewed. Timelines were reconstructed. The consistency of the accounts left little room for doubt. The conclusion was unavoidable. On October 8, 1918, one American soldier had neutralized a German machine gun position complex, killed or wounded multiple enemy soldiers, and captured 132 prisoners, directly enabling the advance of his battalion. York was first awarded the Distinguished Service Cross. Within weeks, that recommendation was upgraded. In April 1919, Alvin Cullum York received the Medal of Honor for his actions in the Argonne Forest. The ceremony was formal. The recognition was immense. York's reaction remained restrained. He did not seek publicity. He did not celebrate his achievement. He spoke rarely about the details unless asked directly, and even then his descriptions were technical rather than emotional. He emphasized that he had done his duty and that others had done the same without recognition. Yet the public narrative moved beyond his control. Newspapers across the United States carried his story as a symbol of individual resolve in a war defined by industrial slaughter. In a conflict where men vanished into statistics, York's story restored the idea that a single human decision could still matter. He became the most famous American soldier of the First World War. Offers followed. Movie studios sought to dramatize his life. Publishers requested memoirs. Endorsements and commercial opportunities appeared almost immediately. York rejected most of them outright. He was deeply uncomfortable with profiting from war. To him, the idea felt wrong, almost immoral. When he eventually agreed to tell his story publicly, it was on his terms. He insisted that any portrayal emphasized faith, restraint, and responsibility rather than violence. He wanted the story to reflect the burden of taking life, not the thrill of it. Even then, he directed much of the money earned toward educational causes in his home region, funding schools and opportunities for rural children. York returned to Tennessee after the war, not to a parade ground, but to farming and community life. Fame followed him there, whether he wanted it or not. Visitors arrived unannounced. Journalists asked the same questions repeatedly. Veterans sought him out, not to glorify what he had done, but to understand how he had endured it. He remained consistent in his answers. He did not claim invincibility. He did not claim fearlessness. He claimed only that he acted when he had no other choice. That consistency preserved the credibility of his story long after the war ended. From a military perspective, York's action became a case study rather than a legend. It was analysed for what it revealed about terrain, marksmanship, and human behaviour under stress. His success did not rely on extraordinary equipment or secret tactics. It relied on fundamentals executed without hesitation. He understood cover and exposure instinctively. He controlled his rate of fire. He denied the enemy freedom of movement. He exploited confusion rather than charging into it. Modern soldiers studying his action often reach the same conclusion. What York did cannot be replicated deliberately, but the principles behind it remain valid. Perhaps the most remarkable aspect of his legacy is what it does not include. York never framed his experience as a justification for war. He did not argue that violence was noble or desirable. He maintained until the end of his life that war was a failure of humanity, even when individual actions within it were necessary. That distinction preserved his moral authority. As decades passed, the Argonne Forest healed. Trees grew where machine guns once stood. Trails replaced ravines choked with wire and bodies. Yet the events of October 8, 1918 remained fixed in the historical record, not because of mythology, but because of documentation. York's action stands apart, not simply because of the number of prisoners taken, but because of the context in which it occurred. In an era of massed artillery, coordinated assaults and industrialized killing, a single soldier imposed order on chaos long enough to end a fight completely. That is why his story endures, not because it promises that one person can always change history. but because it proves that sometimes under impossible conditions one person does. Alvin York did not reshape the First World War. He did something rarer. He finished a battle, and in a war where so few battles ever truly ended, that achievement remains unmatched. If you value historically accurate stories of courage without exaggeration, subscribe to WW1 HEROES. Every episode focuses on documented actions, real terrain, and the men who stood where history demanded a decision.